Check, check. All right, we're going to get started in about 4 minutes here. Okay, it's 6 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and begin. Let me pray for us, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Lord God, we are grateful for this night, and we're thankful that we can be here to study your word. We pray that you would open our hearts to hear you now, in the name of Christ. Amen. Well, tonight we're talking about the Roman Empire. This is a little hot, Randy, this mic up here, so I wonder if are these on? Check, 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 check. So a couple of people last week asked about the triclinium. We were talking about the table that would have been used for the Last Supper. So this looks a lot different than what you would normally think about. When you think of the Last Supper, you think of the famous Da Vinci painting, with everybody sitting on one side of the table in chairs. But you notice that this is a three-sided table, and on the outside of the table would be couches. And so everyone would recline at the table. You prop yourself up on one elbow, and you lean over the table to eat the meal. The food's brought into the center and put on the tables. And so you notice a couple things about this. One, notice where everybody's feet are. That's when we talk about washing feet on John 13. Jesus washes his disciples' feet. That's how it happens. He's able to go around the outside of that triclinium and wash their feet. Now, where's the place of honor? It's not in the center, it's on the left side. So you notice that Jesus, the host, is sitting there. The person to the right is the honored person. So that's what the disciples are fighting over, who gets to sit next to Jesus. Now, this particular rendering that I found has John there. Of course, it says it was the beloved disciple. So there are a lot of people who are wondering, who exactly the beloved disciple is. Is it John? Quite possibly it is. Some suggest it might be Lazarus. Some suggest it might be an unnamed disciple. We're going to call him John for now, just because it's easier. But leaning against Jesus' breast. So if he's on his left elbow, that's how you do that. So just to give you an idea what that looks like, a little question from last week. But tonight we're talking about Rome, and we're looking at a brief history of Rome and its engagement with the land of Judea. And this is an important part of the story that's often overlooked, because it's kind of like salt and pepper through the Gospels. The Romans pop up occasionally, but we don't always understand the underlying influence that's going on all the time here in the biblical story. But to give you just a brief history of Rome, this will take you back to your ancient history. Rome is moving from a city-state to a continental empire as this century is unfolded. You have the Punic Wars in the 3rd century BC, which is the defeat of Carthage. Carthage being in North Africa, modern-day Libya. They were the two big kids on the block. Rome defeats Carthage and defeats Hannibal. If you remember Hannibal crossing the Alps and all of that. And so this expands control of these Hellenistic city-states. So from Greece to the eastern Mediterranean to the northern coast of Africa, that's where this empire is beginning to emerge. And Julius Caesar is the one who really completes that transition from republic to empire. There's a little bit of the republic that remains up to Octavian for about 40 years, but in reality, with Julius Caesar, that's really where most historians mark kind of the beginning of the empire. So who is Julius Caesar? Well, of course, he's a Roman general and statesman. He's one of the first triumvirate with Crassus and Pompey, and he led the Roman armies in the Gallic Wars. So Gaul, modern-day France, that Western Europe area, he's spending a lot of time up there fighting, and he subdues the Gauls, which makes him very popular back in Rome. And at the conclusion of the Gallic Wars, the Senate realizes that he's getting very powerful. So they call for him to step down from command and return to Rome, to leave his army behind. But Caesar takes the audacious step of bringing his army with him. Now, Romans always get nervous when you bring an army back to Rome. Why? Because that's a sign of power. It's a sign of control. So Caesar crossing the Rubicon, we always think of the Rubicon River as being this massive, mighty rolling thing. It's a creek, okay? So he basically crosses the creek, which was the border between Italy and Gaul, and he crosses the Rubicon, comes into Rome, and that causes all kinds of consternation. So two of these members of the triumvirate begin to have conflict with one another. Caesar and Pompey go to war. Here's another civil war, and Caesar's going to defeat Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC. So very shortly after he comes back from the Rubicon, from Gaul, he's going to get into war with Pompey. Pompey flees to Egypt, but the Egyptians, seeing Pompey, they basically arrest him at the beach and behead him. So Pompey, and Caesar's upset about this, but Caesar goes to Egypt to try to sort of find out what happened, and also to kind of punish the Egyptians. But he meets Cleopatra. So you see, she's kind of in the background of all of this story. She's kind of the Yoko Ono of the Roman Empire, if you will, okay? And Caesar's going to have a child with her named Caesarion. And what's that? Somebody say something? I thought somebody yelled out something. He's going to return to Rome then as dictator, but Caesar, of course, is assassinated in 44 BC. If you know your Shakespeare, there's the famous scene, Et tu, Brute, you know, they murder Caesar there on the floor of the Senate. Brutus and Cassius being the ones who are kind of the leaders of the assassination plot. Well, after they murder Julius Caesar, they flee, and they have an army. All these guys have their own armies. It's kind of an interesting thing. There's not sort of a Roman federal army. Everybody kind of has their own army that's loyal to them. And so Brutus and Cassius are pursued by Mark Antony, who was one of Julius Caesar's lieutenants, and Caesar's great-nephew and adopted son, or heir, Octavian. And they're defeated at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC. Philippi, of course, is in Macedonia on the Greek peninsula. Now, this is interesting for a couple reasons for your biblical history. The letter to the Philippians is written to the people, the church at Philippi. But we have to remember that after this particular battle, after this war was over, the veterans who fought in that war, because you don't want to bring that army back to Rome. I was an infantry officer. There is nothing worse to have hanging around than bored soldiers. Bad things are going to happen, okay? So what they did was they took the veterans and they granted them land there in Philippi, and they made Philippi a Roman colony. So as a Roman colony, they had all the privileges. They had the privilege of citizenship. You earned that through your service. So these veterans basically set up this city. Now, when Paul's writing, probably about 70, 80, 90 years later to them, he says to them, remember, your citizenship is in heaven, and it is from there that we're expecting a Savior. That only makes sense. Now, we think of that, we think, well, our home is in heaven, that's where we're going to, you know, things like that. But notice the trajectory. From there, we're expecting a Savior. These are Roman citizens now in Philippi. Several generations now from these veterans. But they've never been to Rome, most of them. Their job was to colonize this area with Roman religion, values, all those kinds of things. Their citizenship was held in Rome, but they weren't going back there. Their life was here in Philippi. So what is Paul saying in that particular text? He's saying, you know, that yes, we're citizens of heaven, we're citizens of God's kingdom, but our life, our home is here, and that's where we're to bring it in. Remember we talked about Rome and said, when anywhere, do as the Romans do? That's what we're talking about. When anywhere, as Christians, we bring the kingdom of God, we use our citizenship to bring it there. Doesn't mean we're not going to heaven, but it does mean that the primary focus is always downward. But that only makes sense if you understand the background of Philippi itself. He's writing to Roman colonists, okay? There's another civil war then. Antony and Octavian go to war with one another. Their alliance breaks down. Octavian convinced the Senate to declare war on Cleopatra in 32 BC. Mark Antony goes to Egypt, and guess what? He falls in love with Cleopatra too, and they become lovers, and they go to war. But Octavian defeats the forces of Antony and Cleopatra at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BC. Now, your question is probably the same as mine. How does a naval battle work in the days before cannons? What does that look like? Well, it involves a lot of arrows and a lot of ramming. You know, if you've seen Ben-Hur, for example, when they put him down in the hold and they get into ramming speed and all that stuff, that's what's happening. The only way you can really sink a ship is by ramming it. But Octavian defeats, catches them. They're in kind of in a bay, corners them in, destroys their fleet. Antony and Cleopatra flee back to Egypt, where they famously commit suicide. Mark Antony first, thinking that Cleopatra had already done it. She hadn't. And bummer for him, but then she eventually takes her own life as well, realizing that Octavian is coming for her next. What happens to Caesarion in all this? What happens to this child? We don't know exactly. We know he doesn't He doesn't grow up at all. So somebody bumps him off to make sure that Julius Caesar's line is not going to carry on. I mean, he's not the legitimate son anyway. So, but this brings the rise of Augustus. Octavian then becomes the first emperor of Rome, officially. He restores order. The Senate gives him a lifelong tenure as commander-in-chief and tribune. And so he adopts the title for himself, Augustus, great, magnificent. So when you think Augustus, he shows up there in Luke chapter 2. Caesar Augustus declares a census that all the world should be taxed. That's Octavian, who defeats Mark Antony. And he reigns for a good long time, from 27 BC to 14 AD, almost 40 years. And he completes this transition in Rome from the Republic, which was generally governed by the Senate, now to an empire where the dictator's making the choices and the Senate kind of goes along with what he's doing. Now, he does a lot of reform and solidifies a lot of things. The first thing he does is he expands the territory. He makes peace with the Parthian Empire. Remember, the Parthian Empire is to the east, the old Persian Empire, right there on the border with Judea. He institutes a Roman system of taxation because he's going to engage in a lot of civil engineering projects, primarily focused around roads. He's also going to create a standing army, and this is where we see the imperial cult, or the cult of the emperor worship, come into play. Augustus mints coins, and this is one of the ways that you did, how would we put it, political campaigning, message giving in the ancient world. You print up coins, they're circulated everywhere, so they speak on behalf of that particular dictator. So Augustus has coins printed up, and some of them say that he is son of God. Why son of God? Because he declared that Julius Caesar, his great uncle, when he died, became a god. So here is Augustus, now a son of God, and he's also declaring himself Prince of Peace. Why Prince of Peace? Because once you've killed off all your enemies, there's peace. So this is Augustus. And he puts these Roman legions to work. These Roman legions are not just fighting units, they're actually also engineering units. And you can travel around in places in the Mediterranean world and still see the remnants of these Roman roads that are there. They're very solid. I mean, this is an incredible engineering feat, given that it's all done simply by manpower. A lot of it done by legionaries, some of it done by slaves, but you'll notice the different layers that they build up in order to build a Roman road. You can still walk on these today in so many different places. So they're making these roads everywhere, which increases the amount of communication between areas. People are able to become more mobile. And those roads are also patrolled by the Roman army. So they're a little bit more safe from bandits than travel used to be. Now, if you really want to go quickly, you take a ship. So when Paul goes on his missionary journeys, how does he travel? He usually travels by boat. But it's also more dangerous to travel by boat because the Mediterranean Sea is notorious for storms. And so Paul gets shipwrecked, a couple times. Things happen. So these Roman roads then become the primary way that people are connecting with one another. Well, when Augustus dies, his stepson Tiberius is given the throne. Augustus doesn't have a child of his own, so he gives it to his stepson. And Tiberius becomes emperor at age 55, and he's not really interested in being the emperor, to be honest. He's forced to divorce his wife and marry his stepsister Julia in order to keep things in the family, and it's an unhappy marriage. He's a good administrator, but he's always going to be in the shadow of Augustus. It's always great to be the first guy, but when you're the second guy, everybody compares you to the first guy. And Tiberius, first of all, is not really that interested in being emperor, and second of all, is not as prolific as Augustus, so he decides that, well, since I'm the emperor, I'm going to rule by proxy. So he sets up his government there in Rome, and he goes into sort of a working retirement on the island of Capri, where it says, he spends all of his time lounging about the pool, letting fish nibble on his toes, and things like that. And a lot of other nefarious, notorious stuff that goes on there, Roman decadence. But Tiberius is kind of, out of the picture. It's interesting. There was a movie a few years ago called Risen. It was about the resurrection of Jesus. And at the end of that movie, they had the emperor coming to visit Judea in a boat. Like, here comes Tiberius. This would have been during the period, after the resurrection of Jesus. Here comes the Emperor Tiberius to visit Judea. Never happened. He's not going anywhere. He's happy where he is. But he rules until about 37 A.D. And, right after the time of Jesus. But there's a city on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee named Tiberias, after the emperor. It was built by Herod Antipas, but Jews generally didn't go there. Why? One, because it was a pagan city. It was named after Tiberius. And two, it was built on a graveyard. So you notice in all of Jesus' travels, it never mentions that he goes to Tiberias. He just doesn't go there. So you have this period of time, as we talked about last week a little bit, where Rome and Judea are in this tense occupation. Herod Archelaus, who was one of Herod's 3 sons, who was supposed to rule over the Jerusalem area, is deposed because of misconduct. He's very abusive and things like that. Now, how abusive do you have to be for the Romans to get rid of you? Pretty bad. There's a revolt. In 4 BC, 2,000 Jewish rebels were crucified. Rome thought that was a bit heavy-handed, and so they remove him, and they're going to replace him with a Roman governor for the Jerusalem, Judea area. Herod Antipas is still the king up in Galilee. Herod Philip in the Transjordan, across the Jordan River. And this is kind of the situation when Jesus is doing his public ministry. You have these 3 sort of areas, all of them essentially controlled by Rome, and one of the driving forces there was taxation. And one of the problems that caused a lot of revolts was taxation. So, Quirinius, who was governor of Syria, he's mentioned in Luke chapter 2. There's a revolt by Judas the Galilean in 6 A.D. Jesus is a small child. And as part of that revolt, the city of Sepphoris is destroyed. Sepphoris is about 4 miles from Nazareth. So everybody would have known about the time the Romans came and destroyed Sepphoris. There are a lot of scholars who believe that Joseph and Jesus made their primary living by doing contract work rebuilding Sepphoris, because it was within walking distance for them each day. It's an interesting theory. But if they were stonemasons and not carpenters, it makes more sense. Or if they were carpenters, they're making tools, things like that for that particular thing. The problem is that there is tax revolt going on all over the place. And so we had a question last week about taxes. Who paid and how much? Well, I did some research on this, more than I wanted to, because I don't even like doing my own taxes. And there was a land tax that was paid by landowners, usually paid in grain. So you gave a certain percentage of your yield back to the officials. That was for their use, for public use, so forth. There's also a head tax. We read about this in Luke chapter 2. Go back to your ancestral city, be registered, and you pay your head tax. That was not a normal thing that happened all the time, but occasionally that was the head tax that was paid. The primary taxation, though, was around tolls and duties collected at ports and city gates. So when we think about tax collectors like Matthew, like Zacchaeus, this is very likely the kind of taxation that they're dealing with. They're sitting at the tax booth at the entrance to the city or on the main road there in Galilee, the trade route that goes through past the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, collecting tolls and duties. So when you think taxes, it could be any of these, but primarily we're talking about these tolls and duties. Roman tax farming then is a major point of tension. So these Romans collected taxes through private contractors. They're called publicans. And they're called that in the King James Version, actually, publicani. So the Romans collected the taxes through these private contractors. So the contractor would go to the Roman government and bid a certain amount of money to get the tax contract for that district. So if you were the toll collector, if you were Matthew, you were the toll collector at Capernaum. You would go, you'd probably have a certain amount of wealth, you would invest that with the government. The government's going to pay you back with interest, and at the same time, you're collecting taxes, and now you can begin to charge what you want in order to recoup your investment and a little bit more off the top. So these payments were in effect loans that would be paid back, and the publicani could keep anything they collected in excess of what they bid, plus the interest from the state. So why are tax collectors so hated? What does Zacchaeus say when Jesus comes and eats at his house? Anybody I've defrauded, I'll pay back double. Well, what does that assume? He was defrauding people. So that's one reason that the tax collectors are so hated. The second reason is because who are they really working for? They're working for the Romans. And that's probably even a bigger reason why they're so hated. Zacchaeus, in Jericho, which would have been sort of the gateway city to go up to Jerusalem. It was a major place along the thoroughfare, probably quite wealthy because of where his tax district was. And so when Jesus comes to town, he's up in a tree. And we always sing the little song, Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. He climbed up in the sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. Well, why is he up in the sycamore tree? Maybe not so much because he's short, we assume that, but because if I'm up in the sycamore tree, the crowd can't get at me. I want to see what's going on, but I don't want them to know that I'm here. And what does Jesus do? Hey, Zacchaeus, you come down, So just an interesting point of tension. Now, there's also the temple tax that Jewish males over age 20 were supposed to pay. And this harkens back to the Old Testament, a half shekel for temple maintenance and sacrifices. So by the time we get to the New Testament, the equivalent, it was equivalent of 1 day's wage. That was the temple tax, an annual tax. By the time you get to the New Testament, because of inflation, it's 2 days' wages. But there's no evidence that all Jews paid this temple tax. No matter where you were in the empire, you were supposed to pay this temple tax. There are other ways the temple generated money, but we don't know for sure how many actually paid it. But we do know that there's evidence of this in Matthew's gospel, Matthew 17. People say, to Jesus, should we pay the temple tax? And Jesus says, well, same thing essentially that he says about the denarius in Jerusalem. Render to Caesar what Caesar, render to God what's God's. Here's this temple tax. So God doesn't really care about that, but so we don't give offense, we should pay the temple tax. So what does he tell the disciples to do? Hey, go down to the shore, cast your net in, pull out a fish, open its mouth, and there'll be 4 drachmas, 2 drachmas, and that'll pay our temple tax. Big deal. So what? Here you go. It's immaterial. But pays it in order to not give offense. What are the Pharisees and others trying to get Jesus to do, particularly the chief priests? They want Jesus to say, don't pay your taxes, because then they can brand him as a revolutionary. So you have the Roman military, who is sort of roaming this area. They're kind of keeping the peace. And there are two main types of Roman troops. First, there are legionaries. These are Roman citizens from Romanized areas. And then there are auxiliaries, local people recruited to serve Rome, and they could earn citizenship after their service. So if you served, I think it was 25 years, you could earn Roman citizenship. Judea, because it's so far out, they're garrisoned most likely by Gentiles from the Syria region. So who would be that area who weren't Jews? Samaritans and other Syrians. Some Jews actually did serve in the Roman army. Those who wanted to have citizenship, they did. But they're recruited from these different areas. Caesarea Maritima on the coast, Sebasta in Syria, Samaria. So think about it. These are people who are familiar with the Jews, but they're not Jews. So when we think about, for example, the centurion who lives in Caesarea, who's in charge there, probably making sure that the customs are flowing and things like that, but he's a friend of the synagogue. He likes the Jewish people. So when he says to Jesus, you know, my slave is sick, would you come heal him? People are like, well, yeah, he's okay, but he's probably not a Roman. He's probably somebody who's a little bit more close ethnically to the Jews than a Roman would be. That's why he's got some affinity for the people there in Capernaum. Keeping the peace in Judea, you have 5 cohorts of infantry and 1 of cavalry, so about 3,000 troops there in Judea, and they're garrisoned at different hotspots when needed. They would spend probably most of their time at Caesarea Maritima on the coast because that's where it's a more Romanized place, and it's on the sea with sea breezes, whereas Jerusalem is hot, dusty, rocky, and full of Jews who want to kill you. So where would you want to spend most of your time? So when they come to Jerusalem, usually for the festivals like Passover, they stay at what's called the Antonia Fortress, which Herod the Great built right next to the temple. Because where was the center of problems going to be? If there were going to be problems, it was going to be there in the temple. So they're garrisoned at the Antonia Fortress. By the way, who's the Antonia Fortress named after? Mark Antony. Mark Antony. Herod the Great, making sure his bread's all buttered on all sides, right? Later on, after the time of Jesus, in about AD 70, the 10th Legion, the Fretensis, was staged in Syria to put down Jewish revolts. Now, these would be troops that would contain some of those Roman soldiers. But primarily around the time of Jesus, these are more auxiliary troops that are there in Judea. These auxiliaries, we read about centurions. A centurion is in command of a century of about 80 men. And it takes 10 centuries to make up a cohort, and 10 cohorts, I think it is, to make up a legion. So a legion, think about 5,000 men or so, but the centurion in Capernaum, again, we talked about him. You have the centurion at the cross. When the centurion at the cross says, surely this man was the Son of God, we think that's a very curious thing for a Roman centurion to say. Why would he say that? This is just another Jew. Unless the centurion is an auxiliary who understood Jewish eschatology and understood the Jewish desire for a Messiah. Could be. We don't know. Doesn't name him, kind of moves off the scene after that. The point is they're both likely to be auxiliaries. And that leads us to Pontius Pilate, who I think is a very interesting case study. He's mentioned, of course, in our creeds. Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate. Why of all the people does Pilate get mentioned in the creeds? One, I think it puts it in a historical context. But two, it also says this is the time period, where this is taking place. And Pontius Pilate was a real person. That's one of the things the gospel writers, I think, are always trying to get us to understand. We're touchstoning actual history here. There was a stone found in Caesarea when they were excavating the theater there. And if you come with us to Israel, we always go to that theater in Caesarea. There was a step there in the theater that had this stone that was put there, and it was inscribed with Pontius Pilate's name. Pontius Pilatus, Prefectus Judea. What does it mean? Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. So he is one of these Roman governors assigned to that area after Archelaus was deposed. And his tenure is going to reveal the tension between Rome and the Jewish people in very stark ways. So briefly, what we know about Pontius Pilate, or at least what we think we know, Josephus gives us some background on Pontius Pilate, that he was a Roman of the equestrian class. So he's kind of a Roman knight. And he would have been a military officer, a prefect, from the clan of the Pontii. That's what we can infer from his position and his name. And he's appointed to this prefecture by Sejanus. Who's Sejanus? Well, remember I talked about Tiberius, who's kind of ruling by proxy? Well, Sejanus is back in Rome. And Sejanus is the one who is actually administering the empire while Tiberius is on vacation. And he's the one who's going to appoint Pontius Pilate to the governorship there in Judea, which would have been kind of a dubious assignment. Of all the places you could be sent as a Roman governor, who wants to go there? It's not a place. I mean, these Jews are always revolting over taxation. They're always causing trouble. They believe in one God, which would make them essentially atheists because they didn't believe in the Roman gods, at least in the Roman eyes. Who are we going to send there? So they send Pontius Pilate. Now, Pilate is interesting because either because he doesn't like this place and these people, or because he is naturally cruel and recalcitrant, does he get sent there. And he is going to act out his angst about being there in Judea. Josephus tells us about a series of provocations that happen. The tensions start to rise under Pontius Pilate's predecessor, Gratus. And Sejanus, who is an anti-Semite himself, says, I got just the guy to send there. He sends Pontius Pilate. And Philo, another historian, says that Pilate was naturally inflexible, a blend of self-will and relentlessness, given to briberies, insults, robberies, outrages, and wanton injuries. Executions without trial, constantly repeated, ceaseless and supremely grievous cruelty. So not a good guy. And he's a bad governor. His first year, he brings Roman standards with images of the emperor into Jerusalem by night. That's a violation of the first commandment, and the second commandment, and the third commandment. So the Jews are naturally upset, because what do those standards have on them? They have images of Tiberius, but they also have Roman eagles. What are you not supposed to make graven images of? People or animals. Here you go. So the Jews wake up one morning, there are all these standards there in Jerusalem. Whoa, time out. This cannot be. So they protest. There's actually a large group of Jews who goes to his residence in Caesarea. So Pilate's going to spend most of his time in Caesarea on the coast. That's where they find the stone. He's got a palace there that he lives in. Only goes to Jerusalem when things are heating up or if he has to go. So they come out to Caesarea and they protest. And Pilate says to them, basically, you all need to disperse or I'm going to kill you. And these Jews are so adamant about this violation of their religious sovereignty, their monotheism, that they actually get down on the ground and they bare their necks. And they say, we'd rather die than have our city defiled. Pretty powerful. And Pilate backs down because he realizes probably killing all these people is not going to look good back in Rome. Because what am I killing off? Taxpayers. Okay. Pilate relents. And then there's another incident where all these funds are coming into the temple tax, all this money is coming into the temple. People are coming in and paying for their sacrifices. The money changers in the temple. What's their primary focus? The money changers in the temple are kind of necessary because they're changing Roman coinage into Jewish coinage. Because what's the problem with Roman coinage? It's got the emperor's image on it. It's always interesting to me when Jesus is there in the temple and they come and say, should we pay taxes to Rome? And Jesus says, give me a denarius. And one of the religious leaders whips out a denarius. He's like, you're busted right away. Because what are you carrying around with you? This denarius with an image of the emperor on it. You're already violating the third commandment. Okay, problem. So Pilate is going to confiscate these funds. He's going to appropriate them, and he's going to build an aqueduct. Now, the picture here is an aqueduct in Caesarea. The Romans were famous for building these to bring water from places at a distance and to craft these aqueducts that would bring water from a far distance into a city. So he builds this aqueduct, and the crowds protest. Hey, this is our temple money. What did you do? Well, Pilate, at the protest, he briefs some of his soldiers. He has them dress in civilian garb, and when the protest is at its height, he gives a signal, and these Romans whip off these costumes, and they pull their swords, and they start killing people. We think Jesus is meaning this when he's talking about this. I think it's Luke 13. When he talks about, what about those people whose blood Pilate mixed with their sacrifices? Remember this text? What about the people the Tower of Siloam fell on? He's talking about, being prepared at any time, to meet God, to be ready for the day of salvation. I think he's referring to this particular incident when Pilate orders this sort of murdering of the crowd there in Jerusalem. And so when people say, hey, you had your soldiers do this, he goes, no, these were civilians dressed. They did it. Your own people did it. Plausible deniability. You get the idea of the kind of guy we're dealing with. So we come to the trial of Jesus, which is Pilate's big moment on the world stage, as far as we know. He comes to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. And some historians have speculated that because it was the first day of the week, which for Jews is Sunday, not Monday, Jesus rides into Jerusalem from the east, down the Mount of Olives on a donkey, a kingly entry, mirroring sort of a performance art of Zechariah 9, lo, your king comes to you riding on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Some scholars speculate that probably on the western side of the city, coming from Caesarea, would have been Pilate with his legion on a war horse. Think of the contrast. It's an interesting idea, interesting juxtaposition. Whether they did it at exactly the same time or not, we know that Pilate's going to come into the city because it's Passover, and that's going to be a time when their city is swelled with people and a time where revolution might be in the air. So there's a lot of tension going on as this is happening. Jesus is arrested by the temple authorities and brought to Pilate. And Pilate sees this as an opportunity because he's always tweaking these Jewish leaders. He's anti-Semitic, doesn't like them, and likes to kind of tweak them, screw with them whenever he has a chance. And he wants to release Jesus. This guy's not a revolutionary. I've seen revolutionaries. I've killed plenty of them. This is not one of those guys. But he's cynical and he's vacillating. He's not wanting to be involved in this Jewish dispute. Get this out of my face. This guy is not a problem. Yes, he draws crowds. Anytime people draw crowds, that's a red flag for the Romans. But when Jesus is on trial, Pilate begins to realize, if I don't give the crowd what they want, I'm going to have a riot on my hands. So he appeases the crowd. Remember what they say to him. He says, shall I let him go? If you let him go, you'll be no friend of Caesar. And what does Pilate want most of all? To be a friend of Caesar. Because that's how you get out of this dusty backwater and you get to a really good assignment down the road. So he's a pragmatist. And his exchange with Jesus is very interesting. What is truth? He brings Jesus out onto the pavement. Behold the man. You know, it's almost a mockery act of praise, but we know that it's truth. This is the one. You know, the whole idea about releasing Barabbas. I'm going to preach on this on Good Friday. Barabbas in Hebrew means son of the Father. And Barabbas is a revolutionary. The two people who are crucified on either side of Jesus, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a couple weeks. The two people who are crucified on either side of Jesus, we always call them thieves, as though they're petty criminals. The Romans didn't crucify petty criminals. They crucified revolutionaries. The Greek word for them is leistai, which is basically revolutionary. So this is a problem, and they're going to crucify Jesus as a revolutionary among revolutionaries. But as we're going to talk about in a couple weeks, that is going to have a major role in how we understand the cross. Because the way Jesus dies is as important as what his death means to us. Those things are conjoined and combined. Well, Pilate is around from 26 until about 37 AD when he blocks a procession of Samaritans wanting to worship at Mount Gerizim. So Mount Gerizim was the center for Samaritan worship. That's where their temple was. And the result was there was a battle, there were casualties. The Samaritans appealed to the legate in Syria, to Pilate's boss, and Pilate is sent to Rome for trial, and we never hear from him again. So here's this person who kind of appears and disappears off the history books, but plays a major role in the gospel story. So major that we mention him in our creeds. Now, all this is going to lead eventually to a head. It's going to come to a head. This revolt over taxation, revolt over treatment, revolts over problems with the Roman governorship, all those kinds of things are going to lead to the Jewish War in 66 to 70 AD. So there's increasing tensions. These are actually present during the time of Jesus. Think about the people Jesus is recruiting as his disciples. You've got Matthew, who's a tax collector, was a collaborator with the Romans. And then you've got a guy named Simon the Zealot who wants to kill the Romans. Imagine their conversations, what that would have been like. So you have these kind of tensions that are building and building and building, and the Zealots plan this revolt, and they expel the small Roman cohort that's there in Jerusalem, kick them out of the city. Well, the legate Gallus arrives from Syria, and Vespasian, who's a Roman general, is dispatched from Rome to put down this revolt once and for all. And so Jerusalem is put under siege by Titus. Titus is connected to Vespasian. Vespasian becomes emperor in the year 69. They call that the year of the four emperors. There were four emperors that year because of assassinations. Even Rome, they can't keep their stuff straight either. So this leads to the Jewish war. The temple is destroyed by the Romans accidentally. It wasn't their intention. most likely to destroy the temple. But it happened. And how did it happen? Well, how does a stone building collapse in the ancient world when you don't have dynamite? Well, somebody builds a fire, and things catch fire. The roof, of course, is not stone. There's wood everywhere. Fire catches, heats up the keystones, and they crack and fall over. And if you come with us to Israel, you'll see there's the rubble of the retaining wall, the top of the retaining wall of the temple, down on the street where it fell some, I don't know what like 80, 90 feet down onto the pavement. Big, huge blocks of stone, just destroyed. And the temple was leveled. And the war continued, though, up until about 73, when the last holdouts at Masada, remember Herod's palace, down on the Dead Sea, the Romans lay siege to it, and they build a siege ramp. It takes them a long time. They build this siege ramp up there, and finally they break through the wall, and when they break through the wall, they discover that everyone but a few women and children have committed suicide rather than be captured. And if you stand on top of Masada today, you can still see the outlines of the Roman camps. The stones are still there. Perfect squares all the way around it. When Jesus is talking about the sun being dark and the moon turning to blood, when you hear about the desolating sacrilege, flee to the mountains, pregnant women, it's going to be bad for you in those days, all those kinds of things, those apocalyptic warnings in Mark 13, for example, they're talking about this. Now, there's some eschatological understanding down the road a bit, but we tend to always think, Jesus is talking about the end of the world. Well, what he's talking about primarily there is the end of the world as they knew it. Because once the temple's gone, your world is crumbled. And this won't be the last time there's a revolt, as we'll talk about here in a minute. This is a picture of the rubble at the base of the retaining wall there for the temple. Mark 13, Matthew 24, Luke 21, Jesus saw where this corruption and the zealotry of political revolt was going to be headed. And so he urges his followers to flee in front of that. And so you're going to notice in the book of Acts what happens. The center of the church shifts away from Jerusalem very quickly after the day of Pentecost. And it suddenly becomes centered in Antioch, which is further up the coast, modern day Turkey. Jesus is vindicated. He predicted all this was going to happen, so here it is. And it was the end of the world as they knew it. Later on, there's a second revolt. It's called the Bar Kokhba War. Revolt against Rome led by Simon Bar Giora, known as Son of the Star. He's another messianic kind of pretender, but the Romans crushed the rebellion. Simon is killed, Jerusalem is leveled, and the Jews are finally expelled. The city's renamed Aelia Capitolina by the Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian's around in the 2nd century A.D. And that leads to a very long period of time where Jews and Christians are not really in Jerusalem. He rebuilds the city, builds a main street down the middle of it called the Cardo, the heart of the city. That you can still see remnants of that in different places underneath the rubble, underneath the different layers of the city. But the bottom line is, this is sort of the end of Judaism and Christianity really in Jerusalem as the center, not until you get to 1948. Think about how long that is. Of course, you have the Crusades. You have some Christian control. You have Muslim control. You can literally go to the outsides of the walls there at Jerusalem, and you can look at them and see the different blocks, and you can date who was in charge at each level. from the Romans, from Herod to the Romans to the Byzantines, to the Turks, or to the Muslims, to the Turks, to modern day. I mean, it's incredible, the different areas. Remember, this is the hallway, and all these other empires are rooms in the house. But you can see it right there in the strata of the walls. It's pretty amazing, actually. So this is the Roman influence. Paul, of course, is a Roman citizen. How did Paul get his Roman citizenship? He's from Tarsus, southern Turkey. Well, most likely, his father was a merchant and purchased his citizenship. His mother is Jewish, because your Judaism always comes through the mother. And there are a lot of scholars connecting dots, but what was Paul's profession when he was in Corinth? He sat down with Aquila and Priscilla and was doing what? Making tents. Who needs tents? Roman army. These are heavy wool or leather tents, so they're making tents. Purchased his citizenship. But it's Paul's Roman citizenship then that is going to allow him to appeal to the emperor. When the crowd wants to kill him in Jerusalem, he appeals to the emperor, they ship him off to Rome. And that's where we leave him at the end of the book of Acts. Rome is the big kid on the block. But Rome, here's the irony in my view, they actually create the conditions for the gospel to spread. They create the conditions that eventually are going to bring this empire down. They make roads, they make transportation easier, they have a common language, they provide security. Of course, they're also providing taxation, oppression, anti-Semitism, so people are turning to a different way of being. There's war and destruction, and yet Rome creates the conditions for the spread of the gospel. Most scholars date the fall of Rome to about 410, when the Visigoths come in and take over. But what happens next? The Christian Revolution. 4th century, the Roman Emperor Constantine is going into battle, and he has a vision, Battle of the Milvian Bridge. He has a vision of the sign of the cross. And he hears a voice say, "Under this sign, conquer." So he has his soldiers paint the cross on their shields. They win the battle. Constantine essentially decides, okay, now we're all going to be Christians. Now, did Constantine, was he an authentic Christian? Most likely not. He's baptized on his deathbed, but you never know, right? His whole thing was Christianity is good for the empire because it's the new power. Because by the time, and think about this, from the beginning of the book of Acts, when Christianity becomes this small sect to a heavily persecuted minority through the 2nd, 3rd centuries AD, by the time you get to the 4th century, a large portion of the empire was already Christian. Enough that it became the official religion of the empire. Think about what it took for that to happen. Now, I would argue, as many people do, that Constantine wasn't great for Christianity. Because what did it do? It put Christianity in power. And what did Christians in power start to act like? Romans. Institutionalized, hierarchical, all those kinds of things. Went from being a movement to being an institution. You can argue that all day. But I think there's no doubt that Rome creates the conditions for Christianity. God uses these pagan Romans, just like he used the Babylonians, just like he used other people throughout history, to further the cause of his kingdom. So it's the perfect time. Jewish communities are scattered across the empire before and after 70 AD. Nobody's going back to Jerusalem anymore. It's an opportunity for a new message to be spread. And where does Paul go when he visits all these places? He goes straight to the synagogue. So, four minutes left. Questions? Do we have microphones? Yeah.
In your section here that you titled The Crisis Point, can you give me a date range of that being?
Let me see. Let me go back to which slide you're talking about.
Yeah, 28.
There.
This one.
Yep.
Yeah, the crisis point. Jesus is talking about this in, let's say, 27 or so. The crisis is actually going to get more intensive, but it's going to reach its breaking point in 66. So if you think about Paul, basically the era of Christianity that Acts talks about is happening in that interim period. So we think Paul is around, in the 50s, 50s or so. The temple is still there. All those things are still part of it. But by the time you get to Revelation, for example, a lot of people think that John, the writer of Revelation, probably writes later in the first century, like more like 90 or something like that. So when he's writing Revelation, that whole imagery of this destruction is in the background. Because when he's talking about the beast, he's talking about Nero, who is actually earlier. But all these Roman emperors are essentially, the beast. Rome is the great Babylon. Yeah. Other questions? Okay, so next week we're going to talk about Jesus' own self-understanding. What did he believe about his mission? What did he believe, and what was the symbolism that he was using? For example, what does Jesus mean when he's talking about himself, refers to himself as the Son of Man? We think about Jesus as Son of Man, Son of God. What do those things mean? What was his self-understanding, and how did he express that in ways that people would have picked up in the first century that we don't necessarily pick up today? Because there's a lot of biblical underpinning to all of that stuff that's going on. So just to keep that in mind as we come together next week. Lord, bless and keep you, and make his face to shine upon you, and be gracious unto you, and give you peace. Amen. Thank you.